All right. What's up, everybody? This is Ryan here, and you are watching episode 74 of my live stream Q&A. So before we get to the primary talking point of the show, which is going to be basically fiddling around with model view Viewmodel and a demo application I recently put together by request. I have been inundated with requests to build a model view Viewmodel application with generally speaking, Firebase, Room, a bunch of stuff from Android Jetpack, so navigation. So what I try to do is put together kind of my best attempt at current best attempt. Well, best attempt. There's a lot of I'll get into some issues with the whole model view model approach and stuff like that, which there's some things we got to talk about. But in any case, the application is functioning, and I posted the repository in the description of this video down below. It's going to be Jetpack MVVM, Jetpack Notes MVVM or something like that. I can't remember. But anyways, before we get to that, of course, we have the part of the show where I asked for support. So please do me a favor, if you learned something from this video or you like my content, then consider hitting the like button down below and subscribing. And also, most importantly, if you would basically like an introduction to programming in general, programming, software architecture, solid principles, all kinds of best practices, and the Kotlin programming language, then do consider trying out my course, link in the description box below, on Udemy. So it's basically an introduction to the Kotlin programming language for people of basically any level. You can be an absolute beginner, you can be a more experienced Java developer, and you're looking to reuse some of the same patterns that you use in the Java platform, except you want to do it in Kotlin. But yeah, whether you're super interested in Kotlin or not isn't the most important thing, because it's basically a course about just teaching general programming fundamentals. So do consider picking it up, and if for some reason you can't afford to purchase the course for regular price or a discounted price, and there are discount promos frequently, then just let me know via Facebook or Slack, and I'm happy to send you a free license to the course, because I know exactly what it's like to not be able to afford an education as a programmer. In fact, I have no post-secondary credentials whatsoever, except for 3 courses. I shouldn't say whatsoever. I've got 3 post-secondary courses, but other than that, I have no degrees in anything. So, except dishwashing. I have a PhD in dishwashing. So, anyways, that's basically my rambling there. And then we'll get to rambling. This is going to be a very, hopefully this will be useful for people, but I'd like this particular Q&A to be quite interactive and rambly, and I'm going to ask for the people watching. I'll answer whatever, but for the first little while, I'd like to just focus on talking about model view Viewmodel, at least how the Android team sort of interprets it. And I'd like that to be the main focus of today's show, but that's always largely dictated by by what questions I get. So anyways, what's up? How's it going, Al? Good to see you. Anyways, so we're going to talk about model view Viewmodel, and I don't have anything really super specific to say about it. Except that this is the little application that I put together last week. So basically what it is, let me open up the nav graph. This is basically the gist of the application. It's 3 different views. So we have a login view, we have a note list view, we have a note detail view. So it is essentially just like Space Notes, except the difference is that it's built with model view Viewmodel model view Viewmodel architecture. Now specifically, I tried to do this very close to how it's advised and typically done in the Android team's official applications and documentation for this particular pattern. So basically what that means is that it breaks separation of concerns, which I'm not exactly happy about, but there's an extent where the level of abstraction and separation of concerns that I normally apply in my projects could be too much. Anyways, let me just enter in here. Hey, what's up, Stanislaw? Good to see you. Anyways, so I'm just going to talk about a couple general points here, and I'd really be happy if people just kind of chimed in their own thoughts. So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about, this is our main topic, is model view model architecture, but let's talk about implementing navigation from Android Jetpack. So a couple points on this particular topic. So what I did end up using navigation in this project, and the basic way that you set up navigation with Jetpack is once, assuming you have it added to Gradle, you create a navigation graph. So down in this navigation directory here, we have, it doesn't have to be called nav graph, just like all the other XML resources. The name isn't actually so important, name of the file. And in it, you basically set up a bunch of destinations. So a destination can be like an activity, it can be a fragment, generally speaking. And you can do other stuff. You can pass arguments to different destinations. So this is kind of like in some ways, a replacement of passing data via intents, but there is some limitations to it, which I'll mention in a minute. So we've got two, I just want you to notice we have two fragments as destinations, and then something which you won't typically see in people who implement navigation with the style which the Android team suggests. So what the Android team is basically pushing is using a single activity approach to navigation. So your whole application only has one single activity. I wanted to do that, and there's only one activity for the note list view and the note detail view. I ended up just calling it note activity here in this note package here. But I was unable to actually do single activity because navigation is not yet integrated with onActivity result. So that's, I mean, there's ways you could, but they're ugly and hacky, and I'm just not going to advise that for people. So I did manage to figure out that the Android team, the navigation team, and all that stuff, they are aware of that. It's a low priority item for them. So I don't particularly agree with that, but that's totally fine. Anyways, basically in this application, if you want an idea of how to set up navigation, other than looking at the Android documentation, have a look at this nav graph, and you can play around with that to figure out how to set up destinations and stuff like that. When you actually need to call this stuff, then let's go to, say, for example, note detail view. So you have to set some crap up in your activity. So you create this navigation controller thing, which is going to basically use the your particular navigation graph. If I go to and this is a generated class, if I recall correctly. Let me just double check on that. Activity note. No, that is not a generated class. So you need to add a this nav host fragment type thing. There's a couple different ways to set this up. I think you can do this programmatically. But here I just added the navigation host fragment to the main activity, and then all the views are just separate activities. So we have like, if Android Studio would load a little bit quicker, we have fragment note detail, and that's just the stuff I showed you in the graph. And fragment note list. So there's basically, that's basically it for that kind of setup. So you create this thing, and then within your views and your navigation setup, when you want to go to a different view, you can say find nav controller.navigate. One of the things that was trickier to set up is to actually use the safe-args feature. So passing arguments between the views, you have to use, again, I'm not super happy about having to add another plugin to Gradle, but it's really not that big of an issue. But there's one feature in navigation called safe-args, which allows you to pass type-safe arguments. So this is basically like a replacement of using intent and having to do all the null checks and stuff like that. So this thing was okay. It worked pretty well. I had some weird behavior with this library, to be honest, in some cases. Okay, so let me go to, we'll do note list view. So in the note list view, when we want to actually say pass arguments to another view, so in this case when we're in the note list view, the user selects a particular note, then we want to look at a detailed view of that note, and we need to send the ID of that note to the note view. And how we do that is with this particular thing. So again, this part was a little tricky to set up, and I actually had an annoying bug earlier where I can't actually figure out for sure if this was caused by the navigation library, but it was kind of refiring some particular, which one was it? It was kind of refiring this particular live data when the application returned to the view. Some bizarre bug. Anyways, this is how you get arguments into one of the receiving destinations in your nav graph. So you need to specify whether it has an argument. So in this case, the note detail view accepts an argument, which is called note ID, and it's of type string. And then when we want to navigate to that thing, then we have this huge generated function here, pass the note, and then we call navigate. And a direction object is basically, I don't know what it is under the hood, but it's going to be all this crap molded into some kind of JVM bytecode. So that's basically what it is. So anyways, yeah. So overall thoughts on navigation. Let me I'll try and review it in a couple different ways. So let's start with the ease of setup. I would say let's do okay, let's say what do I think of navigation out of 5? I shouldn't hear so let's say out of 5. So ease of setup, I would say that was about I would say based on the actual what the library actually does for me, probably ease of setup would be like I don't want to be too, I'm going to say 2. I was going to say, I don't feel right saying 3, I don't feel right saying 2, but we're going to say about a 2.5 out of 5. So it wasn't easy to set up. It wasn't like learning Dagger 2 or RX Java for the first time, but it felt like just a lot of boilerplate and ceremony to replace the thing I used to do, which was to just have a separate activity for each. Well, actually, I might still do that, to be honest, but having a separate activity for each feature of the application. That has its own problems too, but it's pretty easy and it's fairly reliable. So I'm going to give it about a 2 out of 5 on the ease of setup. What else can I think about here? Usefulness. So I'm going to I would take more points away just because it didn't have on activity result implemented, which prevented me from basically doing what was suggested, doing the actual single activity. But I do think it's a somewhat useful library. I'm going to give that maybe a 3 out of 5. It's really quite useful in certain use cases, but the fact that there's some things that are pretty buggy, yeah. Is there anything else I really care to? Would I recommend it? I guess might be. Well, I don't know. I think we'll stick with just those two factors here. So, not my favorite library. I don't think it's a horrible one, but to be honest, like the fact that we're, again, maybe I'm just getting older or something as a developer, but when I start having to once again, fiddle around with this degree of XML boilerplate and that kind of thing. I mean, it does have a really nice graphical editor, but it's still XML. I don't know. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not sure if I would recommend it at this stage. If it did have integration with onActivityResult, then I think I would be willing to just live with it. But the fact that it doesn't have that particular use case implemented or supported yet is, I'll be honest, that kind of sucks. So anyways, I don't want to be too mean, though. I feel like I don't ever... I'm always worried if someone from the Android team actually watches this and thinks I'm just hating on them, because I do appreciate that the Android team is trying to build these sorts of tools, and I think what I'll do is I'll probably review navigation again in maybe like a year or something like that, and I think it's just still in development. So anyways, I think that's all I'll ramble about navigation. So I had a question from Stanislaw, I think, or a comment, or... Oh, from Marco first. So why room with Firestore? Oh, why? Sorry, I'm trying to understand your... Why room with Firebase? So I think you're... I'm going to assume Marco... So Marco asks, why room with Firebase? Well, so are you talking about this specific application? Because this particular application, basically, I don't want access to Firestore for unregistered users, whereas for users that aren't logged in, whereas if users are logged in, they can use the Firestore. So basically, again, let me pull up the repository and we'll talk about this a little bit. So we'll go to Firebase note REPL. That's a mouthful. So just a brief, what's the word I'm looking for? Disclaimer. I like that, disclaimer. So this is a demo project, and normally I would apply more abstraction to this particular repository here. So as you can see, we have a Firebase note REPL, which talks to Firebase auth and Firestore and a note DAO from Room. So normally I would actually stick the local and remote behind their own interfaces, which would extend the same interface. But this thing would basically be holding these things as interfaces, and it wouldn't know explicitly that it has Firebase and this thing. And I would probably figure out another way. I would have a domain layer which would be capable of talking to Firebase auth. I wouldn't do everything like this, but this is a basic repository implementation. So I believe the question was, if I'm interpreting it correctly, why do I have Room and Firestore and Firebase auth here, and what's the purpose of that? So one important thing to note is that Firestore is actually capable of working offline. I think it does that by default. If not, there's an option you can set in it that does that. So what I basically do in this application is I just ask auth, hey, is there an active user? Is somebody logged in? If there is somebody logged in, and I don't, in this application, I don't like store the user's credentials or anything like that other than in the auth system, just because I don't want to mess with people's data. But if there's an active user, then we say get remote note. And if there's no user logged in, then we just get whatever's in the local repository. And this is the same for the basic create, read, update, delete operations. So this was just a quick way to deal with users that are and aren't logged in. So yeah, hopefully that kind of answers that. And let's go to... Oh, interesting. So, Stanislav, I have a question, Tovarish. So, you mentioned, Stanislav mentions navigation is the only thing which survived under his development. What didn't you like about live data and Viewmodel? Because those were actually two things from architecture components which I did quite like. So, I'd be curious to know why you didn't like them. Not to have an argument, I'm just curious. And then we have a question from Saroj. Saroj asks, have I tried Work Manager? No, I don't think Work Manager... Let me look this up now. Android... I don't think Work Manager actually solves a problem for my applications. But I haven't actually used it, so I can't say that for certain. What does this thing do? I'm literally just going to go on the Android website. Yeah, I don't do this because I don't need it. This is what I use coroutines for. I wish they could just briefly explain... Okay, so what does Work Manager do? So it's about background processing. What is the specific use case for Work Manager? Okay, for work that is deferrable and expected to run even if your device or application... Okay, I guess I don't have any need for this right now. I thought... so there could be some use cases if I like really needed to go... yeah. I haven't had to use it yet. This wasn't exactly what I thought it was, so it's possible. Anyways, I don't think I'll ramble about that. Yeah. Anyways, just looking at the chat. Hey, what's up, Ruhul? Okay, it's about scheduling multiple background processes. Thanks for the info, Al. Yeah, I haven't used it. I don't have a use case for it, and so let me show you a quick example. You know, if you're working in Kotlin, I really think you should adopt. You should consider adopting coroutines. Like, if you want to basically thread your application using coroutines. In your back end, just make sure everything's a suspend function. And if you need to jump to the background thread, like I do whenever I talk to Room here, all I do is I just add this with context, dispatchers.io, and then it just jumps when it needs to onto the IO thread. And Room is kept happy, and if I don't need to do that, I don't, because these suspending functions will operate synchronously, but they won't block the thread. So I really like that approach. I don't think I need... I certainly won't be replacing that with Work Manager. So just commenting... so Stanislav, I do agree that RxJava is more powerful than live data. I think that's very evident. Having used both, I think the use case where I like to use live data is just strictly Android front end. I've never done live data. I think I did it once in a demo app, but I don't suggest using live data in the back end, even if you're using Room. I guess if Room was like, if you really just wanted Android architecture components libraries to just take over your entire architecture front end to back end, then you could use paging and live data. But I don't at all. But I do like live data in the front end of the application. I find it somewhat useful there. Could you use RxJava instead? Yes, but the problem is you don't get the benefit of it being lifecycle aware, and that's why I do actually prefer live data for front-end observables instead of RxJava. It's just strictly because they're lifecycle aware, and I don't have to worry so much about disposing them. Anyways, let's see. As far as Viewmodel, though, I actually like Viewmodel, but that's fair. We all have different styles and approaches. Even I was commenting in the Slack channel earlier, one thing I like to do is I'll often have a Viewmodel as what I would interpret to be a Viewmodel, so just like a front-end storage unit for front-end state. To me, that's exactly what a Viewmodel should be. Oh yeah, also just a quick random point here. So I should be able to, in fact, decouple. So this is a Space Notes application. This is more of a, it's model view whatever, which is kind of the style of architecture I follow. I used to say that's my style of architecture, but now I found out that someone else has already used the term model view whatever. So I guess I have to figure out a new name for my style of architecture. Maybe I'll call it model view logic. But the way I basically build applications is I'll have, say, a view of some kind. I'll have a view. If I need one, I'll have a view model if I need to like store data so that I'm not storing it in the logic class or the view. And then I'll have a logic class, which is kind of like a presenter. It's just I don't think presenter is a very good word, and I don't want people to assume that I'm doing model view presenter strictly. But in that architecture, I will often have a view model as well. So if I open up the logic class, any logic class here, let's go to note detail logic. It'll have the view, and it'll also have a view model. Now the view model doesn't worry about publishing state to the view or something like that, which I might actually do something like that eventually. Have the view talk to the view model, observe the view model, but still have the view talking to this logic class to for example, deal with user interface events and something like that. So, but yeah, I totally forgot why I was talking about that, but I think I just wanted to ramble about view model. So let's see, questions. Yeah, that would be an. See, when I use just commenting on Stanislaw mentioning that the boilerplate for view model to get dependency injection into it is a real hassle. That's why the way I use view models, they don't require any of that crap. I just use these mutable live data objects, and so when a feature of the application starts up, the logic class will request whatever data it needs to start things up from the remote, or not the remote necessarily, but just from the data sources. And then it'll feed that data into the view model and kind of get it started. And then I don't have to worry about just injecting into the view models or having to test this thing, because it's basically just a humble object that stores front-end session data safely. And this is very different from how the Android team recommends you use view model. I'm not saying they would advise against it, but this is, I guess I'll get to this part. let's talk a little bit about Viewmodel, model view Viewmodel. So here's the problem I have with this particular style of front-end GUI, graphical user interface patterns. So let me kind of give a quick breakdown of what model view Viewmodel is. So typically the view is responsible for the same kind of stuff that a view normally does, except it has the added responsibility of observing data from the view model. So maybe I'll try and do some code while I talk about this. So let's look at, say, note list view. So it has a view model. It can talk to it. That's fine. However, if I go to note list view model, this thing cannot talk to a view. You will not find a reference to any view in this class. So just a precursor here, this is not how I normally build applications. This is my interpretation of the Android team's approach to model view Viewmodel using most of their libraries. So the view model talks to the backend. It requests the appropriate data from the backend. And we use the repository pattern in here because basically no matter what architecture you use, I think you should be using the repository pattern unless you're 100% certain that you'll never need to change anything in the back end. So this is basically what happens is the view model will request data from the back end. It'll write that data. So here we have noterepo.getNotes. It'll write that data, depending on if the action was successful or not, to these live data objects, which this is basically the, I have a specific video on live data in Android. If you don't understand it, please go watch that video because I basically explain how live data works. It's basically like the observer pattern. But yeah, we set the value of these live data objects. And what happens, how the data actually gets into the view is that in the view, we observe. So here we have this function observe view model. We observe the live data objects in the view model. So I've got one here, note list. So that'll be the list of notes, of course. Edit notes. So this is this is where view model starts to get ugly, is that when you have a situation where you don't need to actually pass data to the view model, or the view rather, but you need it to do something, then you have to set up like these kind of odd observables. Also, if I open up base view model, all of my view models extend this base view model, and there's a couple things that should be common to basically every view. So for example, an error state and a loading state. So if you're wondering where note list view error comes from, it actually comes from the base class. And so how you set it up is the view will observe the view model. What that allows you to do is you don't have a situation where we have, like, for example, val view, you're not allowed to have a friggin' view reference in the view model. So that's basically model view model. It's the only, I've looked at like so many different projects and read so many different articles on this thing, and there's many ways to implement it, but the one thing which appears to be consistent about model view model is that you're not allowed to have reference to a view from a view model. You can only expose the data through the observer pattern. There are costs to doing that. And the problem with this particular approach is that it breaks, or at least makes it very difficult to actually achieve separation of concerns, because we have two problems going on. So there's kind of two different ways to do model view model. In fact, there's many different ways. The way that Android suggests is they basically want your view, which will normally be a fragment or it can be an activity, they want that thing to be full of logic. They want it to be full of this kind of stuff here. Whatever data the view model publishes, it has to decide what to do with that data in some, what can be some pretty clunky functions. I could do a slightly better job of, doing a less spaghetti code approach, but this is basically just what I had to work with because I wasn't able to do things like I normally would do. So you can either do that approach, or what you could do is you could have your view models have very explicit data about a specific view. Now what I mean by that is, let's say for example in what's a good example here? So let's maybe go to the login feature. That might be this is the correct thing. Okay, so we're going to go to login view and user view model. So what I could do is I could basically have the so the view would observe the view model, and the view model would have basically, for everything that every widget in the view, it would have like a data model. This is actually close to model view intent, if I believe. I haven't actually seen model view intent, but I was learning about it. So you could have the view model basically publish the whole update to the UI, and then the UI would just grab all of that data and kind of reset itself. And so you would have like a series of different states. So I could, again, I can't type it out quickly, but in a view model, I could have like val state null user as an observable, and then I would just basically call this thing if the backend returns that there's no user, and then the view would quite dumbly, passively just grab that model data and bind it to the user interface. What's the problem with that? When you do that, you lose the many-to-one ratio of views to view models. You're tightly coupling to a particular user interface screen. So the problem I see with this pattern is that it's just not always clear or practical when the view should have the logic to decide about rendering the user interface, or when you should have a view model basically make all of those decisions and then build like something it can give to the view that the view renders, which I would prefer to do it that approach. But then again, in order to do that, you're filling your view model with all kinds of logic about displaying the view, which I'm like, this is the problem with this friggin' pattern, is that it's not done consistently, and it's not clear to beginners or even people like me when it's best to prefer to fill your view with logic or to prefer to fill your view model with logic. I don't like to do either. I like to have a view model when I need it and a view. These two are humble passive objects, and then I have a logic class which has all of that awkward front-end decision making type code. So anyways, the point of this is to basically say, for all those people watching this, I know a lot of people ask me about model view view model versus model view presenter, and they want to know what is the best architecture out there. And the honest truth is that there's no architecture that works great in every situation. Model view view model certainly is not the perfect architecture. Certainly not. It's, in many cases, if you have complex synchronization logic in your front end between your view and your view model, you're going to get this ugly situation, and you're going to have to break separation of concerns to some degree, or just kind of work around that. So anyways, I'm not saying don't do model view view model, because the good thing is that it's really easy to set up, I find. And if I had like a feature of my application where there wasn't complex synchronization logic between the view and the view model, then I think it actually would be way more efficient to do that than to go through all the ceremony of having your your presenter and your view and model and a view model and all this kind of stuff. Like, there's certain cases where it totally would be a more efficient and easier situation. So the point I'm trying to get at here is, like every other architecture, it works good in some situations, it works bad in some situations. So yeah, anyways, let me get back to the comments here. I didn't realize I was talking for quite that long. Yeah, Fiction Studios shares, again, I'm going to assume he, but please correct me if I'm wrong, statistically speaking. Fiction Studios, I'll just say Fiction Studios is mentioning that I should make tutorials and post on Android daily so that I can get more views instead of making more live code sessions. So, again, like I'm going to be producing better quality content. I've never wanted to be one of those people that just posts a whole bunch of short, popular, and not especially informative videos. So I do get what you're saying, and I am going to be posting more tutorials soon. But I'm not going to stop doing the live content because I actually really take pride in the fact that I can stand here and talk to people about and help them solve problems. And to me, that's just way more important than popularity. Now, that's always bitten me in the ass because a whole bunch of people who do run that model, and I'm not saying it's a bad model, and I'm not saying all of their videos suck. Please, I'm really not shitting on any other YouTube teacher. I don't do that. I'll make fun of Vivs maybe sometimes because I sent him $100 back in 2016, so I have a right to. But but other than that, yeah. Views are not really my biggest concern, though. I really want to make content where people learn really good stuff, and that's my goal. Okay. There is a whole bunch of... Let me just see here. I gotta catch up on the chat. Wow. So Saroj, you're not entirely... so you actually can use Firebase to perform background work. Or sorry, Firebase. You actually can use coroutines to perform background work, and that is a great way to use it. That's not just mentioning on that particular note, and I don't think Work Manager would be a better replacement for it. Also, no, this is not Viper. I don't actually do Viper architecture strictly. I've heard my architecture compared to Viper before, and it is very similar, but it's not exactly the same, because I don't actually have a strict pattern that I use in every feature. My style of architecture is based on what I think each individual feature of the application requires. So sometimes it'll have a view model, sometimes it won't. Sometimes, generally speaking, it will have like the navigator, but yep. I see. This is a good point. So this is a comment from Stanislaw. The Android team is trying to do their best, really, but the less Android dependencies we have, the better our code is, unfortunately. Over time, I've more and more kind of moved to that conclusion. Like, I think the best example of that would be the paging library from architecture components. This is me sharing my perspective. I had a quick look at the paging library, and it looked kind of cool. Okay, so if you have like a huge data set, you want to be able to page through it, and it works really well with the recycler view, which can be a little bit problematic to set up. But the problem with the paging library, when I looked at it, hopefully it hasn't changed, or it's possible I just totally misunderstood it. But when I looked at the paging library, I would have had to basically hand over my entire architecture to this one library for one particular, or well, it depends on how many features have a recycler view, but I would have to basically let my architecture get taken over by this paging library, and I would have to just get rid of the whole idea of having like a domain module of my application which doesn't have any Android dependencies, because I didn't see a way that you could actually go like Android app front end, domain layer, Android app back end, use paging library and actually communicate through those layers, which is a practical necessity for the applications I'm building, because I need a domain layer which doesn't have Android dependencies. And so right off the bat it was just like, well, okay, it's great that you guys are building tools to help developers with difficult problems like pagination. It is a problem. Paging is difficult. It's not necessarily easy to logic to write. But the problem I'm more and more seeing is that when we use the library, we don't know how to actually solve the problem ourselves, say on a different platform or a different context. And we also end up having to just rely on how good the API is, whether it's functions properly, it's easy to set up, it doesn't crash regularly. And if any of those things aren't actually the case, then whereas if we wrote our own code, we would know whose ass to kick if it doesn't work. When you're using these architecture components and they just really don't work at all, and I'm not saying that happens often, then it can be kind of a problem. It's yeah, I don't know, I can't think of a great analogy here, but it's kind of like the difference between, let's say you're building a shed. You can buy a pre-made kit to build like a garden shed, and oftentimes that's all that's necessary, and for a lot of people that's what they want. They just want the API that they plug into their application and it solves the problem for them. Generally speaking though, most of these APIs, they're either difficult to set up or they have problems with them that don't work with every use case. So just kind of echoing your point, Stan, that sorry, I was reading comments there, just that I like some of the libraries that the Android team is putting out, and I like what they're doing, but at the same time I'm kind of wary of recommending some of them to people. Anyways, I'm just going to run a quick commercial break and we'll get to some more questions. And if you're running an ad blocker, then you can wait with everybody else. Or if you're not running an ad blocker, I know my ads get blocked by some people who aren't even using an ad blocker. Marco mentions it's better to expose live data instead of mutable live data. I think you're talking about that in the context of my view models here. I'm just curious, why is that the case? Why is using mutable live data here for backend services that don't? Here's the thing, if my backend returned live data objects, I wouldn't be using mutable live data, but they don't return live data objects. So by using mutable live data here, it's essentially like bridging what comes in from my backend into basically front-end Android. So I'm just curious, Marco, why would it be better to use live data here? Like, I would agree if my backend returned live data objects, just key point, but otherwise I don't think I could actually properly use live data objects with this current approach. Interesting point though. Yeah, this is a Stan mentions that my keyboard sounds like it's made from Canadian rock maple, which is a hardwood in Canada. And yeah, this, I'm not even going to show you what the front of this keyboard looks like, but it is very old. Well, I'd like to get a mechanical keyboard soon. Yeah. Al mentions, I think one of the things that confuses a lot of folks is lumping logic into one bin. Back in the day, the mantra was separate business logic from the view. That's a very good point. Like in my architecture, I have basically a front-end decision maker, which leaves as much of the business logic as possible to the back end, and it basically deals with the front-end logic concerns, and then the back-end logic. I don't use the term business logic because it's, when I actually looked into the definition of it by Uncle Bob, I just don't like it very much, but I kind of understand the definition of it. It's really vague. But I do try to keep that kind of logic totally separate. Like a good example of that is that originally I was going to have the, let's see, the note. Originally I was going to have the note list view model. Where is it? Both the note detail view model and the note list view model also depend on a user repo. And what it was going to do is it was going to check and see, okay, is the current user logged in? Then we should, if the user is logged in, then we should go local or remote. And then I realized that's basically a back-end concern. So then I went with that other approach that I demonstrated earlier, by having the, let's see, note. By having that logic, the logic of figuring out whether the user is logged in or not, moving that into the back end and not having that as a front end concern. And that's exactly the kind of thing where if you can kind of do that, it's going to make it so that you probably need to test your back end, but at the same time it just really simplifies the front end by not having to deal with that kind of nonsense and just really worrying about front end kind of view logic. Anyways, Juan Tabares asks, will I use Dagger? I do use dependency injection. Will I use Dagger 2? Not in this application. It really doesn't need it at all. You really don't need to use Dagger 2 in simple applications. Like, you really don't. You can. What I generally advise to people now is if you don't want to piss around with Dagger 2, you can just write your own dependency injection classes. And one thing that works really well is you can, in your dependency injection classes, turn them into an Android view model. Android view model is a special class within Android architecture components, the lifecycle thing, which is designed to hold on to your application instance safely. So from here, I end up building my backend stuff, and the result of it is that this stuff, by using the view model factory, if you are using view models, again, I don't do this in my regular approach. I would give the repository to the logic class, but in a model view model approach, using the factory, you can apply dependency injection. So you pass in your repo and all that stuff. And then you have the build logic separated out. So this is kind of what I would advise to people. In a more complicated app, though, it's generally advisable, I think, to use Dagger 2. What? So... yeah. So Vlad mentions lots of comments here. Hopefully everyone's enjoying this. There's just lots of questions and comments, and I'm trying to really just fly off the top of my head here. So I'm just glad to see that there's lots of talking. So we got, so Vlad is mentioning it's also good to make a new module for every screen, or actually every feature. So I've seen that approach done before. That's like an extreme level of abstraction. And if I was doing, say, like a multi-module setup in a complicated application, like a pretty large scale one, and I wanted to have a lot of abstraction and be able to build for different platforms like web, Android, and iOS, I think I would totally go for that approach of having a module for every feature. I kind of, like, I do typically build in my applications, I do package by feature, and then I'll have a front-end Android app module, but you could definitely take that a step further. Like I've seen approaches where they'll have like a front-end UI module, and then that'll depend on like a common presenter sort of module, or again, it depends on how you're doing it, but a common module which contains like a logic class, I would call it, which is independent of a particular platform, but every view, say you have like your Kotlin JS view, and you have your Kotlin native iOS view, and you've got your Kotlin Android view, they all depend on this sort of common front-end logic and stuff like that. So there's some really neat stuff I've seen with totally lost my train of thought, sorry. Just multi-module setups. Anyways, okay. Yeah, Korean Lab mentions data logic and presentation logic. I actually prefer that naming convention over business logic, and the reason why is, like, when you look up the definition of business logic, at least Uncle Bob's definition, he's basically saying the logic in the application which makes the business money. I'm kind of butchering that, but that's basically the gist of it, is the things that are like specific to your application's problem domain that have to do with making money is the business of, it's the business of the application. Well, that term doesn't really work very well when you're building a calculator. And I got into this huge discussion with someone on one of my videos about clean architecture, and this person was like basically this person was literally talking to me about stakeholders in a calculator application. Now, I get that what they were trying to use their understanding of Uncle Bob's approach to clean architecture, and I have almost nothing but good things to say about Uncle Bob. He's a great teacher, and I've learned a shit ton of stuff from him. But when we're talking, this person was like, so whoever builds like the calculator thing would be the database administrator stakeholder and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, like, okay, we don't need to talk about stakeholders in a calculator app. Like, just no. And anyways, sorry, there's random complaining there. So let's see. So mutable live data exposed to views should be live data so that not everybody can change the state. Again, I see what you're saying, but the view here isn't allowed to change the state of the view model. So this is just, Marco mentioned on the topic of why using mutable live data. Look, I am very familiar that shared mutable state is a problem. Absolutely agree with that. So Marco is talking about, for example, using mutable live data here. So this is a problem if the view was capable or had some functions in it to basically mess with the state of this view model. So the potential is there, and if I was working basically in a team with someone who wasn't on the same page, you could potentially run into that situation. So the thing is, though, like using mutable live data here, shared mutable state, in a style of architecture where separation of concerns is basically out the window to begin with, I think it's actually easier to just use mutable live data in this particular case. I see your point, though. Because you can't just make these things private, because then the view can't observe it. So if you had a situation where the view was, say, saying viewmodel.user.value equals so-and-so, then you would have a situation where the view is basically managing the state of the view model, which is really not the end goal. But it's not a big problem in this particular instance, I don't think. All right. Lots of comments here. Let's see. So I'm not arguing with you, Al. That's just, but that was, I think I can pull up. I have clean architecture right here. That was the definition that Uncle Bob uses. It's the part of the application which makes money for the business. We don't even need to get into that, though, because again, what does the customer require in a calculator application? It already, it's a way of talking about separating the different parts of an application in enterprise systems, and I get that most of the time us programmers are building enterprise systems, and the naming works fairly well in that situation. It's really not a very clear definition. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to sift through here. Stanislav asks if he can share some stuff to read. Yeah, that's fine. It depends on what it is, though. I don't typically I try not to learn from other Android teachers. I try to just learn from my own exploration and knowledge and official documentation and stuff. I don't read too many articles is what I'm saying here. All right, so Stanislav, I had a conversation on my project where should scheduling be handled? My opponent says that the use case should manage that by his own. I think that this presenter, that it is the presenter who decides. Here is what I would, let me share my approach. And when I say this, I'm strongly influenced by my friend Darrell Bitsy. He showed me how to do this with RxJava, in a clean architecture type project, and I adapted the same approach for coroutines. So let me kind of zoom in here, and I'll talk about this. So sorry, I gotta make sure the whiteboard's pretty visible here. Okay, hopefully that'll do. Just give me a moment. So this is going to kind of assume that you're doing like a clean architecture setup. So you've got 3 principal layers. So it would be presentation, domain, and then I'll call it data. Okay. So I'm trying to think of how to do this. Okay. Vlad's upset that the line isn't straight. I can make it even uglier if you like. So anyways, okay, so this is really quick diagram of just a typical sort of clean architecture division. You could think of this as layers or modules. So if the question is like, when should you schedule and move to different threads? So my opinion is, and this is the approach I use, say, for example, in Space Notes. I use it in this application, Jetpack Notes. So in your presentation layer, whether you're using coroutines or RxJava schedulers, generally that's where you should have the Android UI scheduler, or in coroutines it would be the main dispatcher. Yeah, the main dispatcher, whatever the hell it's called. So you would put that in here, because ultimately we want the result, whatever happens to be, to call back to the IO/main thread. Depending on how this is the way I like to do domain layers, is I try not to actually jump threads in the domain layer. And we're talking about a large kind of multi-module project here. So for the beginners, again, this is more advanced talk. But yeah, I try not to actually jump threads in my interactors or use cases, because what I like to do, so I ran into a situation when I was building Space Notes where my backend, in order to use the backend, I needed to jump into the IO thread. But I also had, when I was working with Firebase, there were certain cases where you couldn't jump off of the main thread. If you jumped onto the IO thread in the domain layer, then it would cause problems. The problem came from the fact that room had to be on the IO thread, the calls with it, and then Firebase, some aspect of it had to not be on the main thread. Sorry, had to be on the main thread. So what I ended up doing, and this is something I learned from Darrell Bitsy, is that when he would do this kind of across the application request type stuff, the front end, which has the Android scheduler, for example, in an RxJava setup, it would specify observe on main thread, and then he wouldn't actually say the middle layer wouldn't actually specify a thread at all. The use case or the domain layer wouldn't specify a thread, but it would still be part of the RxJava event stream. And then in the back end, when he needed to, that's when he would jump to the subscribe on IO. Now, my friend Darrell has just recently mentioned, and I think he's going to be talking about this soon, that apparently IO scheduler is not suitable for Android for some reason. So I need to ask him about that. But anyways, we'll talk about that another time. But just for the sake of this example here, jump to the off the thread only when you really need to is my approach. So let me show you, now that I've got that ugly whiteboard example out of the way, let me show you how this would work in like a simple application. So how I do this approach in most of my applications now, so I'll show you how I do it in this MVVM thing because it'll be simple. So my view models extend, where's base view model? Okay. So my view models extend coroutine scope, which means, and they also have this job tracker object, which is kind of like a composite disposable, but I'm not going to talk about it. So like I just mentioned, in my architectures, in the front end, we'll have some class which is kind of like the root coroutine scope, which will be on the UI context, the UI thread type deal with the coroutine context. The middle layer, maybe I should show space notes because this is going to kind of obscure things a little bit, but normally I would have a middle layer in a more complicated application. What I'm basically saying here is that in this simpler application, we just don't have a domain layer, so this example is not going to be super useful. But just the point I'm trying to get at here is that when I'm requesting, say, data from Firebase, so we have our remote data source here, I don't ever need to jump off of the UI context. Its coroutines are suspending functions. It's not going to block the UI thread. It's just going to operate asynchronously, but it's not going to block the thread. I don't need to ever change threads when I'm talking to Firebase with this setup, and when the front-end model kind of closes down, it kind of disposes all of this crap that it needs to dispose of. Or I'm not sure if I've actually configured that yet, but that's what it should do. So what I do is the only time I actually jump to another thread is at the end of the event stream when I really need to. So when as I showed you on this diagram here, when I finally need to jump onto the IO thread with room, that's when I actually would use, for example, with context dispatchers.io here. So that's when I actually would jump to the other thread. To show a slightly more complicated example here, let's go to, I'll show you how this works in like a full kind of clean architecture thing. So I'm going to open up, let's do registered note. Maybe anonymous would be easier. Anonymous note source. Now let's do registered because it's going to be more complicated, but hopefully it'll be a better example of what I just said. So again, this is a different application. This is space notes. And so how this thing works is, again, we have a class which is the coroutine scope. So it's set up on the main thread. So presentation stuff, it's set up to work on the main thread. And this is like the root scope of the coroutine. And then what happens is it's going to talk to, say, for example, our registered note source. This is the interactor. This registered note source does not have any threading in it. The only threading it has is just their suspending functions, which does not care. This thing doesn't actually know. So notice how I put question marks up here. So my domain layer doesn't know what thread or how the threading works. I don't think it should, and it doesn't need to. When I finally need to care about threading, then we get into the, so this would be registered. There's so many repositories, this could take a second. Yeah. So this is now in the data layer I've jumped to, and I don't even think I jumped threads here, because the only time I actually need to jump threads is when I'm working with this local cache, which again is the room, and then finally, once again, we see in the place where it's appropriate with context dispatchers.io. So then finally I jump to the IO thread. So anyways, that was a whole long-winded explanation that to do with scheduling, the general approach I've found works is in your presentation module or package or class or whatever, that's where you would specify, of course, the main thread, which makes sense. You would, if you tried to say, for example, use observe on Android schedulers .main thread in a domain layer, you're tightly coupling yourself to the Android RX Android in your domain layer. So you don't want to do that. So that's why you can kind of skip that. For a little bit, I tried jumping to the IO thread within the domain layer, but not only did that not actually make sense, but it caused problems. So then I just ended up moving that detail into the back end, and that's what I found worked really well for me. And you can do this with RxJava or coroutines. The principle is for RxJava is just that observe on here, subscribe on here if you need to specify that. Anyways, that was a very long answer, but hopefully that was kind of interesting. All right, so I'm not going to talk for too much longer, but yeah. Anyways, see if I can catch up here. Okay, well, yeah, any more questions? Just final thoughts or comments? A lot of rambling in that episode. By the way, Stan, you're welcome for that answer, but that was totally something which I learned from my friend Davel, so I got to give him credit for that. He's going to be... I gotta ask him about this because he just posted in our Slack channel that there's something about RxJava's. Maybe I can pull it up. Let me have a look at Slack really quick here. Yeah, there's something about RxJava which is problematic. I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it here. We had some very, very long conversations in the Slack channel. Adam and Devore. Okay. I'm gonna look for like 10 more seconds and I give up. Okay. Yeah, he basically just said that RxJava scheduler is not suitable for Android, so it wasn't actually. He's going to be writing about it, and I can't wait to see the results of that. Anyways, so Stanislaw mentions, what do I think about open source? Am I interested in contributing? Honestly, if I had my way, that's probably what I would do. Over working in a say like a different setting as a programmer. I would, I'd be interested in open source contributing to actually get paid for it. I like all of my stuff is basically open source, although it's not the same as working in a team. But I am a product of open source software, and if I had to choose, if I wanted to be a developer strictly for the rest of my life, which really isn't the case, then I probably would work on open source projects. We'll see, though. Anyways, I think that's enough rambling for today. Hopefully that was some useful information. We got into some really technical, high-level kind of discussion here, which was kind of fun. But I suspect I lost a number of the beginners in several of the things I talked about. But hopefully, especially the discussion on architecture is important. And yeah, so thanks for watching, everybody. So now that this project is done, I'm going to be moving into making some more tutorials on Android next week, starting next week. So anyways, no problem. And thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you later.